been gone for a couple of weeks. I'm really, really glad to be back home. Thankful for your fellowship and thankful for the memories and just the, I think this is off too here, bro. If you get, yeah. I spoke down in Houston, a legacy dinner for an individual that was significant in my life. Here today because of him, so I think that's fairly significant. And his legacy was the fact that he taught the gospel to thousands of people, literally. He made disciples, he baptized them in the name of the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit. That's his legacy throughout all the world. Wherever his name is said, that's what people know about him. He built the church, the local church. And so I was done a lot of meditating on legacy because legacy in Bible is very, very apparent. And so this morning I'm going to talk a bit about that. I have this book called Haley's Bible Handbook. It's it's kind of a small book that's got good information in it. A lot of you probably have it. Years ago, when Jan and I were in Hot Springs, Arkansas, one of the first congregations we attended was a congregation there. And when we left, they gave us this Haley's Bible Handbook, and I never use it. It's just on the bookshelf. I don't even remember the last time I opened it. But for the study I had this morning that we're going to study, I did open it because it's got good pictures and things like that in it. And so I opened it up and I noticed on the front cover, there were a lot of names. And this church in Hot Springs had given Janet and I this book when we left, but there was one name on there that made a significant difference in my life. I'll talk about him a little bit later. His name was Clarence Ledbetter. But once again, it was about legacy and the impact and the influence that he had in my life. Who's had influence in your life? Who's made a difference? Even if they didn't know they were making a difference. Are you here today because of some of those people? Let's think about legacy and God working among us. God moves among the nations. He's involved in the daily affairs of our lives. We may not know it. We may not realize it. In hindsight, many times we stand astounded by what God has done in our lives. The title of our lesson this morning is God in the Shadows. We're going to study the book of Esther, not all of it today. In fact, there'll be several lessons that come out of it. The word God is not used in Esther. And yet there's probably no more book in the Old Testament that God shouts out his presence and his purpose in what he was doing. So I've called it God in the Shadows. He's there, even though he's not mentioned in the book. We have to understand some historical context with Esther. So I'm going to take just a little bit of time and set this up. Then we'll study first. In 605 BC, Jerusalem fell to Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar overran the city, and the first captives were taken to Babylon. That's when Daniel went, the prophet. In 597 was the second deportation that took captives to Babylon. That's when Ezekiel was taken. And another guy was taken to captivity there that we don't ever talk about. His name was Kish. He was the great grandfather of Mordecai, who was Esther's cousin. And as we talk about Esther and the things that God brought out in this letter, it's things like that because Mordecai had an amazing legacy of a relative that came out of Jerusalem, his great-grandfather, which I think founded Mordecai and his deep conviction of God being involved in his affairs. In 586 was the third time that captives were taken from Jerusalem to Babylon. That's when Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego went. And then in 539 BC, there was a powerful Medo-Persian king by the name of Cyrus that took Babylon down, moved the captives from Babylon to Susa, which was 200 miles to the east. Susa is 900 miles from Jerusalem. Those captives were a long way away from there, from Jerusalem. In 536 BC, Cyrus sends the captives back. Their 70 years of captivity that Jeremiah had prophesied was over. Not all of them went back. Some of them stayed in Medo-Persia. Cyrus's grandson, Darius, in 520 BC, authorized, they'd started rebuilding the temple. It was stopped. Darius will reauthorize it. That's Ezra chapter 4 and chapter 6. And Darius is a great supporter of this effort to rebuild the temple in Jerusalem. In 490, Darius launches an attack against Greece. He's going to conquer Greece. But all the city-states in Greece banded together, and at the Battle of Marathon in 490, they beat Persia bad. Marathon is about 25 miles from Athens, as I understand it. A runner by the name of Philippides ran 25 miles to find out what had happened with the battle. He then ran back to Athens 25 miles with the message, "We won," and he dropped dead. History says that that's probably where our Boston Marathon came from. The son of Darius, a guy by the name of Xerxes. Xerxes is the Ahasuerus as we start our study in Esther. He's the king. In verse 1 of Esther, it says, "Now in the days of Ahasuerus, the Ahasuerus who reigned from India to Ethiopia over 127 provinces." So he ruled a major part of the world. He was the richest king in ancient history. And between Esther chapter 1 and chapter 2 will be a major war where Xerxes takes on his dad's effort to overrun Greece. And between Esther's chapter 1 and 2, the Battle of Thermopylae will be fought, or Hell's Gates. History says that the number of soldiers that Persia had, that Xerxes had, they're all over the place, but probably somewhere around 200,000 soldiers marched into Greece. At Thermopylae, or Hell's Gates, 300 Spartans and about 900 Thebians held that pass until somebody turned in a pathway behind them, and thus it led to Persia winning that battle. He went from there then to Salamis, which was a naval battle. And Greece sunk their whole navy, just beat them bad. And then from there in 479 BC was the Battle of Plataea on the plain of Plataea. And once again, Greece just beat them bad. And so Xerxes limped back to Susa. His remaining army either starved to death or were killed by disease. He went back with relatively nothing. He'd lost the whole event. Esther becomes queen of Persia. We'll study this as we go through this. I'm just giving some historical background. Esther becomes queen of Persia about 30 years before Nehemiah is sent to Jerusalem to rebuild the wall. Xerxes dies 13 years after he marries Esther, and his son, Artaxerxes I Longimanus, or Long Arm, will take his place, will become king. The Bible doesn't say it, but I'm pretty sure he's not Esther's son, her stepson. and she's the queen mother. In 458 BC, Artaxerxes issues a decree that any Jew anywhere can go back to Jerusalem free to travel. And he, in Esther chapter 7, if you'll read it, Esther chapter 7, Artaxerxes gave Ezra anything he needed for Jerusalem to rebuild the temple. Not only say you got anything you need, he said, load up the 18-wheelers, load up the trains. I mean, anything that we can do to help you out in Jerusalem, we'll do. In 445, Artaxerxes I sends Nehemiah back to Jerusalem. Nehemiah was the cupbearer. And what's interesting to me is that when Artaxerxes told all the Jews, you can go back to Jerusalem, no problems, we'll even fund it. Esther, as the queen mother, would have been about 41 years old. She married Xerxes when she was 20, which she was probably younger than that. She would have been 41 years old. When Artaxerxes sent Nehemiah back to Jerusalem, Queen Esther would have been 54 years old. Wonder if she had anything to do with the rebuilding of the temple and the rebuilding of the wall in Jerusalem. You know, is God involved in our daily affairs even when we don't know it? Even when we're not aware of it? Even at times when we think, where are you, God? We need to understand what the patterns and the legacy of God, and as we are here in the Old Testament, because it applies specifically to us today. God is involved in the affairs of the Natick church on a daily basis. Done. Working, preparing, discipling, ministering, arranging the affairs of our work here in Natick. That's his pattern, and that's what I want us to learn from our study of Esther. The objective I want us to get from this study is the power of faith. And are we really walking by faith? I don't mean that as a question. How would I ever define if I'm walking by faith, really? It's rather this that I need to focus on, and that is walking by faith means trusting God, and on a daily basis, what God puts in front of me in my walk are the decisions that I make. That works, doesn't it? I'm not interested in wondering or deciding or determining if I'm walking by faith or not. What I am interested in is the power of faith in seeing what God is doing and how he's leading me in the decisions I'm making as I walk day in, day out. As we study Esther, those will be the things that will come out of it. We'll be very encouraged. We'll get vision for what God is doing as he moves among the nations, as he moves among our church. In Esther, we will address these things. Legislated sexism and racism. Legislated means laws regarding an attempted destruction of a people, fake news, politics, political spin, political irony, political personalities, governmental power, women's leadership, personal ambition over others, war, national debt, the power of a nation, and God's not mentioned in it at all. He's in the shadows. I think that our study of Esther is as contemporary and current as anything we can study. Thus, as we walk forward, we'll be pushed and pressed by faith, seeing what God is doing and following him, submitting to him on a daily basis. So it's the power of faith and walking by faith and realizing that that's what we're doing. So if you'll turn with me, please, to Esther chapter 1. God is in the shadows. What we'll talk about is power, ambition, and wealth. Verse 1 says, now in the days of Ahasuerus, also known as Xerxes, the Ahasuerus who reigned from India to Ethiopia over 127 provinces, in those days when King Ahasuerus sat on his royal throne in Susa, the citadel, in the 3rd year of his reign, he gave a feast for all his officials and servants. The army of Persia and Media and the nobles and the governors of the provinces were before him, while he showed the riches of his royal glory and the splendor and pomp of his greatness for many days. In fact, for 6 months he did this, 180 days. It's a 6-month party. But here's what he was doing. He was building allies. He was drawing mercenaries. He was building an army to go against Greece. So it's not just a party, it's a drawing in and a wining and dining of people to build his army to go against Greece. Susa, history says, was built on 2.5 acres, or the palace, I'm sorry, was built on 2.5 acres. The throne room had 36 fluted columns that were 67 feet tall, 36 of them, supporting a ceiling of Lebanon cedar. The columns were finely carved with different animals and flowers that were quite ornate. And in the middle of this throne room, the text says that Xerxes sat in the riches of his glory, the splendor and pomp of his great majesty. He was on display. Now imagine, as we begin this, imagine reading in the Susa newspaper about the goings on in the city. Thousands of people streaming into the city, being wined and dined for 6 months, building an army. It wasn't a secret he was building an army. What would you be thinking? What would you be imagining? What's the future of this going to be? How much is it going to cost? 6 months this thing goes on. He says, and when these days were completed, the king gave for all the people present in Susa, the citadel, both great and small, a feast lasting for 7 days in the court of the garden of the king's palace. He's going to be gone for 4 years. And what he's doing is he's cementing the loyalty and the patronage of the citizens of Susa itself. It's a political move. All of this was a political move. And he says to them, he brings them into to the court of the garden, and look at this in verse 6. Here's what that garden looked like: white cotton curtains, violet hangings and fastened with cords of fine linen, purple to silver rods, marble pillars. Citizens in Susa had never seen this. They're being invited in to participate and behold something that is so overdone or overbuilt. Couches of gold and silver, mosaic pavement of porphyry, marble, mother of pearl, and precious stones, Drinks were served in golden vessels, vessels of different kinds, and the royal wine was lavished according to the bounty of the king, and drinking was according to this edict. There is no compulsion, for the king had given orders to all the servers, the staff of his palace, to do as each person desired, each man desired. It's like the epitome, the overstatement, the overdone piece to give me your loyalty. Whatever you want. There's no boundaries, anything you want. And then Vashti, his wife, the queen mother, has her own thing going on in the palace with the women. That's verse 9. So think about reading in the paper if they had this about the goings on of what was happening. Perhaps the kind of pastries, the kind of dainties, perhaps the lavishness of the palace on the social pages. I'm just trying to create a picture of the fact that this was a focused event. And then in verse 10, it says on the seventh day of this 7-day party, King Xerxes was drunk out of his mind. Text doesn't say that. It says he was merry with wine. He was drunk. And he calls out to his wife, Queen Vashti, and he says, come in here. I want to put you on display. I want people to see your beauty. I want to hold you up. Text doesn't say it, but history says he wanted her to dance for all of these mercenaries and people that had come in. He wanted to put her on display. She says, not doing it. Love that, don't you? She says, not doing that. And Xerxes gets good and angry. And so in verse 12, it says, the Queen Vashti refused to come at the king's command, delivered by the eunuchs. At this, the king became enraged and his anger burned in him. So she won't do it. I'd like to think it was because of her personal integrity that she didn't want to do it. Text doesn't say. So the king goes in verse 13, king goes to his 7 closest advisors, and he says, what are we going to do? He says, I'm embarrassed. He says, you guys are versed in the judgment of the law. In verse 15, it says, according to the law, what is to be done to Queen Vashti because she's not performed the command of the king Ahasuerus delivered by the eunuchs. Then Memucan will go on and say, for the queen, in verse 17, we got to do something about this, for the queen's behavior will be made known to all women, causing them to look at their husbands with contempt, since they will say King Ahasuerus commanded Queen Vashti to be brought before him, and she didn't come. So in Susa, in the king's court, there's trouble. And his advisors say, if we don't deal with this, we're going to have trouble with the women. He'll go on to say, King Ahasuerus commanded Queen Vashti to be brought before him, and she did not come. This very day, the noble women of Persia and Media who have heard the queen's behavior will say the same to all the king's officials, and there will be contempt and wrath in plenty. Says this is an international event. I mean, this is an international incident, what Vashti did, and it's going to affect women all over the kingdom. Now, you're a woman in Susa. What are you thinking? There's trouble. Been isolated. Said the issue in verses 17 and 18 is this very day, the noble women of Persia and Media who have heard about the queen's behavior, there'll be contempt and wrath and plenty. And so the issue is women's conduct, conduct that's the problem here. It's the male perspective of it. Now, this is not a Jewish perspective. In Medo-Persia, they worship, it was Zoroastrianism. It was a whole different thing. And so, point is, where is God in this? Because of the oppression, the trouble, the sexism is about to happen. And it's about to happen from the most powerful king in the world. So in verse 19, it begins a discussion of the fact that, all right, if we're going to deal with this, we have to write a law. We have to make it illegal to not obey your husband. Where's God in this? You're in Susa. You're reading about this in the newspaper. It says, if it please the king, let a royal order go out from him, and let it be written among the laws of the Persians and the Medes, so that it may not be repealed. We need to write a law dealing with this that can never be repealed. It is irrevocable. That's oppression. That Vashti is to never again come before King Ahasuerus. Let the king give a royal position to another who is better than she. So when the decree made by the king is proclaimed throughout all of its kingdom, for it is vast, all women will give honor to their husbands, high and low alike. I would add, whether they deserve it or not, whether it's convenient or not. It's a law. This is what you will do. This advice pleased the king. He sent letters to the royal provinces, to every province in its own script, to every people in its own language, that every man be master in his own household and speak according to the language of his people. And so the letter goes out to the empire in all the different languages. It's not fair, it discriminates, it's insulting, it's arrogant, and it's abusive. Would you agree? And it's law. And as far as Medo-Persia is concerned, it's law forever. It's irrevocable. There's no solution. There's no way to get our arms around that. There's no way to get hold of it or negotiate it. What we have to do is put it out there and see what God does. That's the book of Esther. That which is unfair, discriminatory, insulting, arrogant, and abusive. What are you going to do with it, God? That's what we're going to find out. That's what we're going to see. That God operates in the daily affairs of his people. And so all of this is taken care of. Xerxes ought to be proud of himself. He didn't have the courage to be the man that he needed to be. So he had a law to enforce what he wasn't. How crazy is that? And so chapter 1 ends. He marches off to war. He's gone 4 years. He comes back severely defeated, lost most of his army. His anger seems to be gone. He's thinking about Vashti, that she's out of the picture by law, when he was just stupid drunk. Chapter 2 begins after these things, after these wars, Thermopylae, Salamis, Plataea. When the anger of King Ahasuerus had abated, he remembered Vashti, and what she had done, and what had been decreed against her. And then his advisors step in, and we begin to see the unfolding of God and his presence, even though he's not named. what was an irrevocable law that would never, ever be undone, God begins to undo for his purposes. How, living in Susa, how could you have ever in your wildest imagination, if you've read Esther, have any sense of what was coming, what was going to happen? Most amazing story of God, which started way back when, as history began to unfold, was God would save his people. Not only save his people, but would rebuild his temple, would rebuild his wall, all by the influence of a young woman who walked by faith.